All right, welcome to your lecture about blood vessels of the head and neck. All right, there are actually two major vessels of the neck I would like you to know. And they are the common carotid artery and the subclavian artery. Two major neck arteries, once again, subclavian artery, common carotid artery. Notice that carotid is spelled carotid, but we pronounce it carotid, so don't misspell it by how we pronounce it. So, we'll first take a look at the common carotid artery. There's a good picture from the atlas that will help us do that. I like to use this picture here. What we see in the picture is the neck arteries right there. Here are the cervical vertebrae. Anteriorly, we have the larynx voice box, and there's the thyroid gland. Okay, so what I want you to know about this is you can see on the left side the common carotid artery, and it ends by bifurcating into the internal carotid and the external carotid artery. Write that down. And one thing you may notice is that carotid bifurcation, which is the end of the common carotid artery, occurs at about the level of the superior border of the thyroid cartilage. So let's kind of write that down as a note. The carotid bifurcation is at the superior border of thyroid cartilage. So if you're taking notes at home, you can copy that down in a second. The carotid bifurcation is at the superior border of the thyroid cartilage. That basically is the end of the common carotid. Okay. The next thing I want to note is that the common carotid bifurcates into the internal and external carotid arteries, shown here, going up the neck. The common carotid artery bifurcates into the internal and external carotid arteries. The common carotid artery bifurcates into the internal and external carotid arteries. So we'll talk about each of those. Here's a picture of a model we have in the lab that kind of models some of the branches of the external carotid I'd like you to know. I'll use the pictures from the atlas shown here to show you some of the branches of the external carotid that are on your study guide. Clear the board again. Branches of the external carotid artery. Now this picture here shows three branches, 1, 2, 3, and notice they all go anterior. This top one is facial, okay? Notice the facial, it runs kind of behind the angle of the mandible. You can see it right here, the body of the mandible. You can take a pulse there. It's the facial artery. Lingual artery goes to the tongue. And this one here, the superior thyroid artery, goes inferiorly to supply blood to the thyroid gland. So let's note those three branches. So these three branches, they go anteriorly. Okay, again from superior to inferior, facial, lingual, and superior thyroid. Okay. Different picture, but same idea. Still talking about branches of the external carotid. There are two branches of the external carotid. They're going to go posteriorly. This branch here, it's going to go to the occipital bone. It's called the occipital artery. This one runs right behind your ear hole, and it's called posterior auricular artery. Remember, auricular means ear. So I'm going to write to go posterior. Okay, that first one, occipital artery. The second one going by the ear hole, posterior auricular artery, because it's directly posterior to the external auditory meatus. Okay. All right, this figure shows the last two branches of this artery. And they're called terminal branches. If you haven't heard that term before, let me explain that. Let's say you have any artery right there, lying on the whiteboard, an artery. And let's say it ends by bifurcating into two. Okay, so that's our original artery. There's an artery, and there's an artery that branched from it. And these two are branches of this one. And this one ends when it branches into these two. So they call these branches terminal branches. That's kind of the term used to describe this one and that one. So that's what we have here. We have two terminal branches of the external carotid artery, and they are maxillary and superficial temporal. Two terminal branches. Maxillary artery, superficial temporal artery. It's superficial, it's barely skin deep under the sub-Q. It runs along the temporal bones. Okay. Here you can see maxillary artery. It's going behind the mandibular condyle. Here's superficial temporal on top of the temporal bone of the skull. Okay. There's actually one branch of the maxillary artery I want you to know, and it's called the middle meningeal artery. Okay, so I'm going to erase this. And know that right under maxillary artery, the one branch of it you got to know, middle meningeal artery. named so because it supplies blood to the meninges that cover the brain, like the dura mater. And so this one has to enter the skull. So I want you to know that the middle meningeal artery branches off maxillary artery, and this artery enters the skull via foramen spinosum. I'll write that. Enter skull via foramen spinosum. Here's a picture of that artery after it enters the foramen spinosum. You can see how it's branching out and supplying blood to the meninges that cover the brain. Okay, it doesn't supply blood to the brain itself, but the connective tissue coverings of the brain. Here's other pictures of the middle meningeal artery. Look at the blue arrows on this figure. It's pointing to, on the picture and on this model from the classroom, the middle meningeal artery, so look for that in our classroom at ARC. We also have models in the classroom that have this half head, and obviously you can see there's a lot of blood vessels on there, we would like you to know. And we have pictures that look like those half head models, and how it is relevant here. This, I want you to notice this gland here. I'll zoom in a little bit. Circle it in green. That is the carotid salivary gland. Let's note that. Side of your face. So it's a salivary gland. You might notice a tingling with the first bite of food. You're stimulating that gland to make saliva to help chew your food. So note carotid salivary gland, because deep to this gland, that's kind of where you get the terminal branches. Deep to this gland arise those two terminal branches. Again, you just wrote it. Those are maxillary, superficial, temporal. All right, moving on. This picture, I have a couple of things side by side. This one you just looked at. This one, they cut away the ramus of the mandible so you can see those two terminal branches, okay? That one going forward, coloring it in green here, that's maxillary. The other one, superficial temporal, I'll use this light blue color. That's superficial temporal, our two terminal branches. All right, let's move on. One last side by side. The blue arrow is again pointing to those two terminal branches right here. Maxillary, superficial temporal, maxillary, superficial temporal. Moving on, let's talk about the other major artery of the neck, subclavian artery. Got a picture of the torso there. And if you remember what we had talked about, our landmark muscle, the arrow, the black arrow, is pointing to subclavian artery. Remember, it passes posterior to the anterior scalene. So let's write that down again in case you forgot. Subclavian artery passes posterior to the anterior scalene. Here's a simplified picture from the book. It just kind of shows you exactly what I want you to see. One thing you might notice, the name of the artery changes when it passes the first rib from subclavian to axillary. So let's note that. The artery doesn't change, just the name. So I'll leave this, the subclavian artery becomes axillary artery. As it passes the lateral border of first rib. As it passes the lateral border of first rib. Know the landmarks. Know where the artery changes its name. That's a big thing in anatomy. The landmarks. The other reason why we use this figure is to teach you the branches of the subclavian artery. So before it passes that landmark right here, it gives off 3 branches that I want you to know. So the subclavian artery has 3 major branches. They are the thyrocervical trunk, the internal thoracic, and vertebral artery. Thyrocervical trunk, internal thoracic, and the vertebral artery. Here's a thyrocervical trunk. I'll kind of trace it right there in green. There's internal thoracic. It's going inferiorly by the sternum. Just kind of draw a blue line over that. And the vertebral artery going superiorly. Kind of trace that in red. I don't know if it'll show too well red on red. Well, let's see. Going superiorly, that big red line I'm drawing in, right there. So again, 3 branches of the subclavian artery. Sure to be a test question. You know those branches. Okay, I want to move on. Let's see here. I'm going to clear those pen markings. Actually, one more on your study guide here. The inferior thyroid. Right here. The inferior thyroid artery is a branch of thyrocervical. We have superior and inferior thyroid arteries in your study guide, so let's note that. So again, one branch you got to know, inferior thyroid, branch of thyrocervical trunk. So I'll write it above here. Right there. Okay, let's move on. Here's a picture of the model. It's pointing to vertebral thyrocervical trunk. The internal thoracic is not shown on this picture. Here's a picture from the atlas. It shows you the internal thoracic artery and vein, how they flank the sternum. They're inside the chest plate, basically. I took a picture of a chest plate in our classroom. Let me get rid of those ink markings. You can see the red structure going up and down, that's internal thoracic. But notice that at each intercostal space, the internal thoracic is giving off branches called the anterior intercostal arteries. Let's remember, posterior intercostal arteries branch off the thoracic aorta. So you have anterior intercostal arteries branching off internal thoracic. Let's note that. So, branching off internal thoracic artery, you have anterior intercostal arteries and branching off thoracic artery, and branching off thoracic aorta, let me write that out. You have posterior intercostal arteries. We already covered that, but it's not shown here. Just reminding you. Moving on. We're going to go back and talk about internal carotid artery. We talked about external carotid artery. We'll talk about its brother, internal carotid artery. We're going to zoom in on that right there. That arrow is pointing to how the internal carotid gets inside the skull. You know, there's only two arteries that enter the skull. One is internal carotid, the other is vertebral artery. Both of these enter the skull to supply blood to the brain. They're the only two. Let me write that down. Two arteries. Enter the skull to supply blood to the brain. They are internal carotid artery, sometimes abbreviated ICA, but please write it out on a test, and also vertebral artery. What we just talked about, a branch of subclavian. I left the space there on purpose. That arrow points to the carotid canal. That's how ICA enters the skull. Enters skull via carotid canal. So let's remember our skull knowledge. So what you're looking at here, this is an inferior view of the cranial base. It's kind of, if you forgot your skull stuff. Now the picture I have next to it, that's a superior view of the cranial base. So it's looking inside the skull with the skull cap removed. You're looking down inside the skull. And the arrow is pointing to ICA after it enters the skull. When ICA enters the skull, it passes by a hole called the foramen lacerum. Okay, We'll note that later. I want to move on to the next slide. This picture shows how ICA kind of goes inside the skull. So it's not a straight shot, is it? It kind of makes all these turns. Here's ICA in isolation. One thing you might note, when the internal carotid artery, ICA, is in the neck, it gives off no branches. But once it gets inside the skull, it gives off many branches. Okay? You write that down. In the neck, not in the skull, in the neck, we talked about the external carotid and the internal carotid. ECA, external carotid, gives off many branches. Already went over it. That's kind of when I talked about 3 anterior, 2 posterior, and the 2 terminal branches. Okay? ICA, in the neck, gives off no branches. It waits till it enters the skull to do that. Gives off no branches. Okay. Here's the ICA in isolation. So down here it says cervical part. That's when you're in the neck. Petrous part is what, and it goes through the petrous region of the temporal bone. That's our carotid canal. Okay? And it kind of gets in the skull. There is one branch of the ICA you have to know. Do you see kind of where the ICA makes this U-turn here? Okay? When it makes this U-turn, after it finishes making that turn, it gives off one branch that goes forward to the eye. That's ophthalmic. So note the ophthalmic artery. The one branch you got to know of ICA. Internal carotid artery. Ophthalmic artery. Supplies blood to eye and orbit. Here's a few pictures side by side to kind of show you ICA inside the skull. The picture on this side here is pointing to the foramen lacerum. I guess the thing to note here, this is a superior view of the cranial base. After ICA enters the skull, it passes by foramen lacerum. I guess that's one thing to note. So inside skull, ICA passes by. Foramen lacerum. The picture in the middle right next to it, let me just kind of zoom back out. Here is the optic chiasm. ICA also kind of passes by there if it's shown. So passes by foramen lacerum, maybe optic chiasm. Period. And in this picture on the right, we see the ophthalmic artery. It's a nice picture showing you how it does supply blood to the eye in orbit. We even see another artery right here. Since I already mentioned it, I'll make note of it again. Color it in blue, this artery. That was the middle meningeal artery entering via foramen spinosum. We already noted it. Maybe you want to note this picture here. It shows both ICA, ophthalmic, middle meningeal artery, entering through that little hole, the foramen spinosum. So these two pictures side by side, we've seen them already. Again, you're seeing the internal carotid artery, kind of by the optic chiasm in both pictures. So one way you can study the arteries that supply blood to the brain you can look at a picture like this and study the arteries on the base of the skull. Remember, the brain sits on top of the cranial base, obviously. So you can also study the arteries on the bottom of the brain. Sometimes they're pictured one way or the other. Here's a picture showing you the arteries that supply blood to the brain on the bottom of the brain, basically, the ventral aspect. Okay, so it's like if you take your skull cap off, you take your brain out, and you take the arteries with it off the cranial base. Here's our optic chiasm, and there's our internal carotid arteries cut. Okay, so let's kind of talk about this. Zoom in a little bit. We call this the circle of Willis. Okay, it's significant that it's a circle because, well, there's something called collateral blood flow. First, let's note circle of Willis. Your book may call it cerebral arterial circle. The point is it's a circle, and it allows for collateral blood flow in the brain. Because it is a circle. The blood can flow all the way around. Allows for collateral blood flow in the brain. That could really prevent a stroke if there's a blockage on one side. Collateral blood flow from the other side can compensate because everything's connected. So this is kind of what we teach for blood supply to the brain. In the two arteries, the internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery, that kind of give you this whole circle. So we can kind of teach half of it now, the top half, because I just talked about ICA. Here it is cut. Let me highlight in blue where it's cut. Right here. In blue and in blue there. Okay. Now, there's a branch that goes forward here. I'll use a different color. How about green? This branch that goes forward is the anterior cerebral artery. And I'll write all these out. Once again, ICA gives off a branch on both sides, anterior cerebral artery. There's a very short artery right in the middle that connects the two sides. That's the anterior communicating artery. Right there, anterior communicating artery. All right, so let's write those three. We have the internal carotid artery. Of course. Okay. There's a branch going forward. In green, that was the anterior cerebral artery. The little one in between them that I colored in orange, anterior communicating artery. Okay, now continuing on, out here and out here, they call that middle cerebral artery. Middle cerebral artery. Let's see. I'll use a different color. How about this yellow color? Yellow and then yellow there. So where I continued it as yellow, call that middle cerebral artery. There's a model in the room, brain with arteries, that kind of has some of these things that we're talking about. And remember, we only talked about the top half. I want to talk about the bottom half, but to do that, I have to go all the way back down to the neck and talk about the vertebral artery again, because you see it here. Okay, but I want you to see it in the neck first, vertebral artery. Before I do that, let's take a break. I'm going to take a break, and you can look for part 2 coming up.